Today I'm reading from World Peace Diet by Tuttle. This is Chapter 2, Our Culture's Roots. The herding culture. Most of us don't think of our culture as being a herding culture. Looking around, we see mainly cars, roads, suburbs, cities, and factories. And while there are enormous fields of grain and cattle grazing in the countryside, we may not realize that almost all of the grain is grown as livestock feed, and that most of the untold billions of birds, mammals, and fish we consume are confined out of sight in enormous concentration camps called factory farms. Though it is not as obvious to us today as it was to our forebear a few thousand years ago, our culture is, like theirs, essentially a herding culture, organized around owning and commodifying animals and eating them. It was roughly 10,000 years ago that wandering tribes in the Kurdish hill country of northeastern Iraq began domesticating sheep and initiated a revolution with enormous consequences. Anthropologists believe it was an outgrowth of the hunting practice of these tribes, who began attaching themselves to particular herds of wild sheep, culling them, and increasingly controlling their mobility, food, and reproductive lives. They eventually learned to castrate and kill off male sheep so that the herd consisted primarily of females with a few rams. From this, they learned selective breeding to create animals with more desirable characteristics. Goats were apparently domesticated soon after sheep, followed by cattle 2,000 years later to the west and north, and subsequently by horses and camels another 2,000 to 4,000 years after that. Highly charged concepts of property ownership and of male bloodlines and bloodline purity gradually emerged, of which there is ample evidence by the time the historical period began, about 4,000 years ago. Our Western culture can be seen as having two main roots, ancient Greece and the ancient Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean basin and Middle East. Reading the earliest extant writings from these cultures from about 3,000 years ago, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and the Old Testament accounts of the ancient kings and their wars, we find that these cultures were oriented around meat eating, herding, slavery, violent conquest, male supremacy, and offering animals sacrifices to their mostly male gods. For the old herding cultures, confined animals were not just food, they were also wealth, security, and power. The first money and form of capital were sheep, goats, and cattle, and for only they were consumable property with tangible worth. In fact, our word capital derives from capita, Latin for head, as in head of cattle, sheep, or in sheep. The first capitalists were the herders who fought each other for land and capital, and created the first kingdoms, complete with slavery, regular warfare, and power concentrated in the hands of a wealthy cattle-owning elite. Our word pecuniary comes from the Latin word pecus, meaning cattle, and the ancient Roman denarius was so named because it was worth 10 asses. Livestock in the ancient herding cultures thus defined the value of gold and silver. Food animals were the fundamental standard of wealth and power. That fact gives us insight into the political might of the ranching and dairy industries that continue to this day.